The moment they pronounced my sentence, my fate was sealed. I stood in the cold, dimly lit chamber of the Valtherus High Court, staring at the towering alien figures before me. Their elongated forms shimmered with an unnatural iridescence, their violet-tinted skin marked with intricate silver tattoos. They watched me as if I were an insect, something to be studied, judged, and discarded. "You are sentenced to shared confinement," the High Arbiter intoned, his voice vibrating through the air like a low-frequency hum. "Until the punishment is fulfilled, you will be bound." Beside me, Ilara's muscles tensed. She was one of them, a Valtherus warrior, powerful and proud. But in this moment, she looked no less doomed than I felt. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, gleaming even under the dim artificial light. Golden eyes burned with outrage, her sharp, angular face set in a scowl. "This is unjust," she spat, her voice a furious melody of alien syllables. "I was protecting my honor, not defying the code." The High Arbiter barely acknowledged her protest. "You will walk as one, your movements, your breaths shared. You will bear this bond together until the punishment is deemed complete." I clenched my fists. "I had nothing to do with this," I protested. "Why am I being punished?" The Arbiter's gaze landed on me, and I immediately wished it hadn't. There was something inhuman about his eyes, like liquid silver, unreadable and unfeeling. "You were there. You exist within the moment of her defiance. That is enough." Anger flared in my chest, but before I could respond, a pulse of energy shot through my body. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like every nerve in me had been jolted awake. Ilara gasped beside me, stumbling slightly as the sensation gripped her too. Then it was over. I looked down at my wrist, where a faint, glowing band of energy now encircled my skin. The same mark glowed on Ilara's wrist. A chain of light connected us, almost imperceptible, yet unbreakable. The sentence had been carried out. The Valtherus said nothing more. The chamber doors hissed open, and we were led out like condemned prisoners, our fates forcibly entwined. The moment we stepped outside, she whirled on me, yanking her arm back as if trying to break free. The glowing chain snapped taut, and an invisible force dragged me toward her. "Stay out of my way, human," she hissed. I staggered, nearly crashing into her. "Maybe you should stay out of mine." She sneered but said nothing. As the Valtherus guards left us, we stood on the platform overlooking the human city below. New Haven. Once, it had been a beacon of human resilience after the arrival of the Valtherus, a thriving metropolis of steel and glass, rebuilt after the initial conflicts. Now, it was just another place under their rule. I turned to Ilara. "What exactly did you do to deserve this?" Her golden eyes flickered to me, filled with something between contempt and reluctant curiosity. "I refused to carry out an execution." I blinked. "An execution?" "The High Command ordered me to exterminate a human settlement," she said flatly. "I refused. That was my crime." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Every human knew the Valtherus were ruthless enforcers of their own laws, but I had never considered that they might turn on their own. "And me?" I asked. "Why am I shackled to you?" "You were there," she echoed the Arbiter's words bitterly. "Wrong place, wrong time." I exhaled sharply. "Great." The chain glowed brighter for a moment, as if responding to our conversation. I lifted my wrist experimentally and took a step backward. Immediately, a force yanked me forward. I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself before colliding with Ilara. She cursed in her native tongue, stepping back herself, only to be pulled forward as well. We both groaned in frustration. "Perfect," I muttered. "This is just perfect." The next few hours were an exercise in misery. Every step had to be coordinated. If I tried to turn left while she went right, we were both pulled off balance. If she stopped walking abruptly, I lurched forward like an idiot. The tension between us crackled like a live wire, neither of us willing to acknowledge the ridiculousness of our situation. We found temporary shelter in a small apartment complex near the city's outskirts. It was my place, A simple, functional space barely big enough for one person, let alone two. The realization that we had to live together made my stomach churn. Ilara looked just as displeased as I felt. She paced the room, inspecting every detail like a caged predator assessing its confinement. "This is unacceptable," she finally said, turning to me. "I cannot stay here." "Well, too bad," I shot back. "Unless you've figured out how to break this thing." I lifted my wrist, shaking the glowing band. She scowled but didn't argue. Instead, she sank into a chair, arms crossed over her chest. We sat in silence. The weight of the chain wasn't physical, yet it was unbearable. It was something else, a pressure in the air, a pull in my very being. It was as if our souls had been forcibly tethered together, their frequencies now forced to align. I watched her from the corner of my eye. Her posture was rigid, but there was something in the way she gripped the armrest of the chair, tension, unease. I didn't know what to make of her. She had been my enemy, then my captor, and now she was something else entirely. Finally, she exhaled. "This will not last forever." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Valthyris do not bind two beings indefinitely. There will be a trial, a test of endurance. If we prove our resilience, the bond will be lifted. And if we fail?" Her gaze darkened. "Then one of us dies." A chill ran down my spine. "You're joking." She didn't answer. I ran a hand through my hair. "Fantastic. So we just have to, what? Get along until they decide we've had enough." She smirked, a sharp, predatory expression. "You assume they want us to get along. That is not the point of this punishment." I swallowed hard. She was right. The Valthyris weren't trying to teach us cooperation. They wanted to break us, to see us crumble under the weight of this forced connection. I glanced down at my wrist. The band glowed softly, pulsing with my heartbeat. Or maybe ours. Ilara watched me carefully. "You do not trust me," she observed. I snorted. "Would you trust me if our roles were reversed?" She tilted her head slightly. "No." I met her gaze. "Then we have something in common." For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Something unreadable. Then she stood. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be more difficult." I sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, can't wait." As I closed my eyes, I felt the pull of the chain even in sleep, like an invisible force binding our very existence together. For better or worse, Ilara was now a part of me, and I had no idea how to survive it. The first few days were a disaster. Every simple movement turned into a struggle. Every attempt at independence was punished by the unrelenting pull of the bond. If I so much as shifted in my seat, Ilara would feel it. If she turned too quickly, I stumbled forward like a fool. The chain was unforgiving, responding not only to physical distance but to intent. We learned the hard way that fighting against it only made things worse. The further apart we tried to move, the stronger the force pulling us back. If she tried to walk ahead without me, she was dragged back just as violently as I was pulled forward. It was maddening, infuriating, humiliating. "You are the most frustrating creature I have ever been bound to," Ilara snapped as we navigated the crowded market streets of New Haven. She moved with her usual warrior's grace, unbothered by the way I stumbled beside her. "Gee, thanks," I muttered. "And here I thought we were bonding." Her golden eyes flicked to me, narrowed in irritation. "Your attempts at humor will not make this easier." I wasn't trying to make it easier. I was trying to make it bearable. She let out a sharp breath but said nothing. That was progress in a way. At least she wasn't outright threatening to kill me anymore. The city was alive with movement, humans and Valthyris alike moving through the streets, some together, some separate. The sight still unsettled me. Valthyris patrols stood at every major crossing, their sleek, dark armor blending seamlessly into the skyline. Their presence had become as normal as streetlights, an ever-present reminder of our place beneath them. Ilara stopped suddenly, and I barely caught myself before crashing into her. She had turned toward a Valthyris officer standing at the entrance of a weapons vendor's shop. He looked at her, then at me. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. "So the rumors are true," he said in his deep, resonant voice. "They have bound you to a human." Ilara's expression remained unreadable. "I serve my sentence." The officer scoffed. "You shame your lineage." Her fingers twitched, a flicker of restrained fury. "And yet, here I stand." For a moment, I thought he might strike her. Instead, he turned his gaze to me, looking down at me as if I were nothing. "This is what you are reduced to? A creature of no consequence shackled to your fate." I wanted to say something, anything, but before I could, Ilara's hand closed around my wrist, the very spot where the bond glowed beneath my skin. The touch sent a jolt through me. Not pain, but something deeper, something I didn't understand. "He is stronger than you think," she said simply. The officer sneered but said nothing more. He stepped aside, letting us pass. Only when we were far enough away did Ilara release her grip. I exhaled. What the hell was that? She didn't answer right away. "They expected me to break under this punishment," she said finally. "To fall into despair. To hate you." I hesitated. "And," her gaze flickered to me, unreadable. "And I do not." The words hung between us, heavier than they should have been. That night, we sat on the rooftop of my apartment, the city stretching out beneath us. The tension between us had eased, just slightly, enough for something else to settle in its place. I glanced at her. "Why did you do it?" She didn't pretend not to understand. "Because I could not kill them." "But why? You're Valtherus. Isn't obedience everything?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We are taught that humans are weak, unworthy. But when I stood before them, before the ones I was ordered to destroy, I did not see weakness. I saw people who would rather die fighting than bow." I swallowed. "That's not what I expected you to say." She turned her gaze to me, the gold of her eyes catching the light. "Neither did I." Something had shifted between us, something neither of us knew how to name. But it was there, and it was growing. The storm came without warning. A cold wind tore through the streets of New Haven, carrying sheets of rain heavy enough to turn the world into a blurred, shifting haze. Thunder rumbled overhead, rolling across the sky like distant cannon fire. Ilara and I ran through the downpour, our footsteps pounding against the soaked pavement. The chain that bound us flared each time we strayed too far apart, yanking us back toward each other. We had learned to move in sync, but in moments like this, when instinct fought against the unnatural bond, we still stumbled. "There!" I shouted over the howling wind, pointing toward a crumbling building on the city's outskirts. Ilara didn't argue. She followed me through the shattered doorway, shaking the rain from her silver hair once we were inside. The space was abandoned, an old storage facility, judging by the rusted shelves and broken crates scattered across the floor. I exhaled sharply, wiping the water from my face. "That was fun." She shot me a glare, golden eyes flickering in the dim light. "Your definition of fun is flawed." I smirked despite myself. "I've been told that before." She sighed and moved deeper into the building, her movements fluid despite the weight of her soaked clothing. I watched her for a moment, still caught in the strangeness of what we had become. There was a time, barely weeks ago, when she had looked at me like an insect. Now, she stood beside me without hatred in her eyes. I knelt near a pile of old wooden debris and pulled out my lighter, flicking the flame to life. The fire caught quickly, its warmth spreading through the room. Ilara stepped closer, the light flickering over her sharp features. Her arms were crossed over her chest, but there was something in her stance, something uncertain. I hesitated, then gestured to the space beside me. "You might as well sit, unless you enjoy standing in wet clothes." For a moment I thought she would refuse. Then, without a word, she lowered herself beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body against my own. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the uneasy kind. It was something else, something waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, she spoke. "You confuse me, human." I glanced at her. "Good to know I'm making an impression." She shook her head, but there was no real anger behind it. When they sentenced me, I expected rage, hatred. I expected you to curse my existence. I watched the fire dance between us. I thought about it. She turned to me, waiting. I exhaled. But then I realized you didn't want this any more than I did. Her golden eyes searched mine, looking for something I wasn't sure even I understood. After a long moment, she said, Valthyris do not form bonds outside our kind. It is forbidden. I raised an eyebrow. Forbidden. She hesitated, then nodded. Not by law, but by instinct. We do not seek connection with other species. It is not our way. I tilted my head slightly. And yet, here you are, sharing warmth with a human. Ilara's jaw tightened. The bond forces this. Does it? I asked softly. She didn't answer. The fire crackled, filling the silence between us. Then, without thinking, I reached out. My fingers brushed against hers. Just a brief touch, a whisper of contact. She tensed but didn't pull away. Something passed between us in that moment. Something deeper than words, stronger than the chain that bound us. It wasn't just the forced connection of our punishment. It was real, and it terrified us both. You said, the night passed in uneasy silence, but something had changed between us. Neither of us spoke about it, yet the weight of it lingered in every glance, every breath we shared in that dimly lit space. By the time the storm passed, the world outside felt different. The city was still the same, cold, indifferent, and ruled by the Valthyris, but something between us had shifted. We no longer fought against the chain. We walked side by side through the quiet streets, no longer stumbling, no longer pulling against each other. The tension that once made every step a battle had softened, giving way to something that felt almost natural. But peace was never meant to last. A Valthyris patrol blocked our path as we neared my apartment. 5 warriors, armored in dark, gleaming plates, stood in perfect formation. At their center was the officer we had encountered days before. Ilara stiffened beside me. I felt the smallest shift in the bond, a ripple of unease, a warning. You have walked this path long enough, the officer said. His silver tattoos shimmered beneath the artificial lights. The trial ends now. Ilara's hand curled into a fist. We have not broken. Which is precisely the problem, he said coldly. The bond was meant to punish, not unite. My stomach twisted. I knew what was coming before the words even left his mouth. One of you must die to sever the connection. Silence crashed down between us like a thunderclap. I felt Ilara tense, but I didn't need the bond to know what she was thinking. I stepped forward before she could speak. You'll have to kill both of us, then, I said, voice steady. The officer's golden eyes flicked to me, amused. You would throw your life away for her? I glanced at Ilara. Her face was unreadable, but something burned behind her gaze. Something fierce and alive. I turned back to the officer. I don't think you understand, I said, voice firm. This punishment failed. You wanted to break us, but you did the opposite. You made us stronger. We walk as one now. The patrol shifted uneasily, but the officer only narrowed his gaze. Then you both die together. He moved before I could react. A flash of silver, a blade glinting in the dim light. But Ilara was faster. She moved with the force of a storm, intercepting his strike before it could reach me. Their blades clashed, sending sparks into the night. The other warriors hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene. The officer snarled. You betray your own kind for a human? Ilara's voice was quiet but unyielding. I choose my own path. She struck, fast and merciless. The officer barely had time to react before her blade found its mark. He staggered back, golden eyes wide with shock. Then, without a sound, he fell. The remaining warriors hesitated. The unthinkable had happened. One of their own had chosen a human over their own kind. Ilara stood tall, unafraid, and I stood beside her. One by one, the warriors turned and disappeared into the night. Ilara exhaled slowly, lowering her blade. When she turned to me, something in her had changed. We are free, she said softly. I lifted my wrist, expecting the bond to still be there, but it was gone. The glowing chain had vanished. The punishment had ended. But as I looked at Ilera, I realized something deep in my bones. We had never needed the bond to stay together. She met my gaze, golden eyes searching mine. And then, in the quiet of the city, she took a step closer. No longer bound by punishment, but by choice. I smiled. So, what now? A small smirk touched her lips. We walk forward. Together. And so we did.